Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank our organizers for putting together this conference and for having me here today. My name is Alix Rousselière. I'm a senior consultant with Novaspace. So for those who might not be familiar with us, we're a global consultancy specialized in the space industry. We've been around for the past 40 years, but under another name that you might be more familiar with, Euroconsult. So the name Novaspace is relatively new. It's about a year old. It was formed when we merged last year with Space Tech Partners. We are headquartered in Paris, but we have offices a bit around the world in DC, Brussels, Munich, Toulouse, and Montreal, where I'm based. So the name is new, relatively new at least, but we bring over 4 decades now of space-specific expertise. Important to mention as well, we are privately owned and fully independent. So, very quick overview on what we do. We're focused on 4 core activities: market intelligence, strategy and management consulting, technology consulting, and executive events. Our work basically spans the entire value chain, so from manufacturing, launch, investment, to the ground segment, to downstream applications like satellite communications and Earth observation. So I head our company's ground segment market report, prospects for the ground segment market. We are going to be publishing our 6th edition soon, end of November. So little PSA, for those of you who are interested in participating in our interview campaign, it's not too late. Please come see me at some point over the next 2 days. So in my work on market reports and consulting, I do a lot of projecting, looking at not just what's happening today on the ground, both technologically and commercially, but how these trends are going to shape tomorrow and the coming decade. So we all know here that the ground segment matters. The more interesting question is how it's changing, so the structural shifts underway and what they reveal about who will capture value in the future. So without any further ado, let's dive right into the strategic outlook for the satellite ground segment market. So the ground segment is the industry's invisible backbone. When it works, and it almost always does, it disappears. Its reliability makes it invisible. It makes it overlooked. So this comes at a cost: underinvestment, duplication, and fragmentation. So instead of focusing on the visible side of space, the satellites, the launch cadence, and such, let's look at what's quietly shaping beneath our feet: the ground that's being virtualized, abstracted, and geopolitically fenced in. So before we dive into the big strategic shifts, let's take a quick snapshot of where the ground segment market is at today, and a few key trends. So today, the global ground segment market sits around the $7 billion range, depending, of course, on how you define it. We at Novaspace, for our purposes, consider government and commercial SATCOM and Earth observation ground stations, looking at basically the market value of the new shipments of these stations for both applications, in addition to user terminals for SATCOM and the ground segment as a service market. As you can see, we have several key tightly interwoven trends that are shaping this market, starting with massive growth on the supply side of the equation, both for SATCOM and Earth observation, largely driven by the proliferation of NGSO constellations, which is multiplying gateway demand. For SATCOM, commercial NGSO capacity has been multiplied by over 115 times between 2020 and 2024, and is set to continue growing in the coming decade with the arrival of new projects, most notably Kuiper, Lightspeed, and Starlink's V3 satellites. So of course, growth here should be nuanced due to the fact that some of the aforementioned players are vertically integrated. In fact, in last year's edition of our ground segment market report, we estimated that about 80% of these new gateways would be captive, i.e. non-addressable to outside players. On the Earth observation side, this supply-side growth is notable as well, with constellations also proliferating and demands for increased resolutions, leading to heavier data to downlink back down to Earth. Second key trend, sovereignty and defense are back at the center of the conversation. Like anybody who attended our Space and Defense Security Summit in Paris a few weeks ago can attest. Governments increasingly insist on assured access to data and communications, which translates into national or allied control over ground infrastructure. This isn't just about security, it's about strategic leverage. Control of ground stations determines who can access this critical information, how quickly it can be delivered, and who sets the rules for interoperability and for usage. As a result, we're seeing a wave of national ground networks, regional partnerships, and security-hardened infrastructure investments, all designed to guarantee autonomy without compromising the benefits of global connectivity. So in effect, sovereignty is shaping the market just as much as technology or economics. And operators who understand this are positioning themselves at the intersection of defense, policy, and commercial opportunity. Thirdly, consolidation is underway across the value chain. We're watching satellite and teleport operators, network providers, and equipment manufacturers merge or integrate vertically and horizontally. Consolidation in the ground system is not just about efficiency, it's a strategic response. Legacy geo-operators and traditional equipment providers are joining forces to pool infrastructure, to standardize operations, and to compete with vertically integrated players like Starlink, who benefit from massive economies of scale. By consolidating, these legacy players can offer broader coverage, more flexible services, and shared ground networks, creating a counterweight to scale-driven newcomers. So in other words, consolidation becomes a tool not just for survival, but for staying relevant in a market where scale and integration dominate. Fourthly, the satellite ground segment is no longer operating in isolation. It's merging with terrestrial networks. So standards like 3GPP and TN are formalizing this integration, enabling satellites, fiber, and 5G networks to work as a unified fabric. And ground is increasingly part of a software-driven network where orchestration, cloud integration, and seamless connectivity extend across both space and terrestrial layers. This convergence matters. It raises interoperability expectations, it challenges traditional ground operators to expand their scope beyond antennas, and it positions the ground as a key enabler for multi-layer, end-to-end digital services, and not just a satellite support function. And last but not least, another trend reshaping the ground segment market is the expansion of the ground data value chain. So for decades, the ground's role stopped at signal reception. We downlinked, we demodulated, and we handed off the data. But that boundary is dissolving. Ground operators are no longer just custodians of connectivity. They're becoming active players in the data processing and value chain. This is especially visible in Earth observation, where the business no longer ends when the image hits the ground. Increasingly, downlink providers are integrating edge processing, cloud ingestion, and analytics layers directly into their infrastructure, turning raw bits into usable information before it ever leaves the ground station. In SATCOM, we're seeing a similar trend, the emergence of network-level orchestration, where the ground doesn't just pass traffic, but manages quality of service, latency, and routing dynamically across multiple constellations. In both cases, the line between ground operations and data services is fading. This creates new opportunities for value capture. Operators can monetize not only bandwidth, but data enrichment, hosting, and delivery speed. We're seeing partnerships emerge between teleport operators, cloud providers, and data analytic firms, forming what you could call an extended ground system. The result? The ground segment is no longer the silent back end of the space economy. It's moving closer to the customer, closer to the point where data creates value. So when you zoom out, the picture is clear. Growth, sovereignty, consolidation, convergence, and value chain expansion are all reshaping what we mean by ground. Of course, the ground segment moves more slowly than satellites. Missions are designed for 10 to 15 years, and ground architectures often outlive them. Regulations, spectrum coordination, and various other constraints make replacement cycles long. This inertia can give the illusion of stability, but under the surface, 3 deep shifts are underway. There are structural realignments that will define competitiveness for the next decade, which brings me to the first and perhaps most fundamental shift shaping the next decade. Let me highlight the first technical shift. So for decades, the ground segment has been exactly that, segmented. Every operator, every mission, every network built its own infrastructure, its own software, its own control systems. And that model worked when missions were simpler and missions were isolated. But today, it's become a bottleneck. It's inefficient, it's fragmented, and it doesn't scale. What we're seeing now is the emergence of a true ground fabric, an interconnected, software-defined layer that can adapt and share resources across missions, networks, and even organizations. Ground systems are no longer static assets sitting in silos. They're evolving into digital platforms that can orchestrate themselves, integrate with the cloud, and respond in real time. Open standards like Diffie, Wave, or 3GPP NTN are enabling that interoperability. Federated networks, including ground station as a service models, allow capacity to be pooled or leased dynamically. The ground is becoming composable, a flexible network of networks, which matches the rapid-paced changes we've seen in the space segment. This shift is particularly key for multi-orbit, multi-constellation service delivery, and for interoperability among nations. In other words, we're moving from a siloed ground system to a smarter, interwoven ground segment fabric. The second shift is economic in nature, the move from CapEx-heavy infrastructure to OpEx-based service models. Historically, the ground segment has been viewed as the plumbing of sorts of the space ecosystem, essential but expensive. It absorbed capital, it generated operating costs, but it rarely created direct value. That perception is changing fast. As space systems become increasingly data-driven, the ground is emerging as a real lever of performance and profitability. When you can optimize scheduling across multiple assets, automate mission operations, or bring ground data directly into analytic workflows in the cloud, you're not just transmitting data anymore. You're accelerating insight and unlocking new efficiencies. Ground is starting to follow the same trajectory as cloud compute: pay-per-use, elastic, and global. This shift is accelerated by investor behavior. Private capital tends to favor asset-light models with recurring revenue. That's pulling even traditional operators towards service-based ground ecosystems. Elastic service models are changing the economics, turning fixed costs into scalable resources, and the ground is no longer where value ends, it's where value begins. The strategic implication of this is clear. Ground operators who modernize early, who build intelligence, flexibility, and openness into their systems will be the ones to capture the recurring value and stay relevant in shaping market dynamics. Virtualization on its own isn't the goal. It's an enabler, but it only creates value when it's paired with resilience and the real control over the network fabric. The challenge, of course, is that margins are tightening and differentiation is fading fast. Virtualization and automation are powerful. They make ground operations leaner, faster, and cheaper. But when everyone is adopting the same technologies, efficiency stops being a competitive advantage. It becomes table stakes. And that's where the risk lies. If we stop at efficiency gains, if modernization means doing the same things with fewer people or less hardware, then the ground segment slides back into being just seen as a cost center, not a strategic asset. We've seen this story before in other infrastructure-heavy industries. In telecom, network operators spent billions modernizing, but much of the value ultimately migrated upward to those who owned the customer interface, the data layer, or the service platform. The same dynamic could happen here. If the ground segment doesn't claim its place higher in the value chain by owning an orchestration intelligence, managing data delivery, or setting the standards that enable interoperability, others will. Cloud providers, hyperscalers, or vertically integrated constellations will capture that value instead. So the real question isn't how efficiently we can operate ground infrastructure today, it's how much influence and value we retain in the process. The opportunity lies in going further, in capturing new strategic value through data integration, analytics, and orchestration intelligence. That's where the future advantage will be built. The third shift is strategic. So still today, the industry equates robustness with redundancy. Bigger systems, backup sites, more hardware. The mindset is very much preventing failure. But in a world of multi-orbit operations, of cyber threats, and contested space environments, failure is inevitable. We used to define robustness by redundancy, so thicker walls, bigger budgets, more hardware, but in this world, that's no longer enough. True resilience means agility, the ability to reconfigure, to reroute, and to recover in real time. It's about being adaptable, not durable. A resilient ground system can operate across commercial and government assets, integrate different orbits, switch frequencies, and maintain service even under stress. In short, resilience isn't about building fortresses, it's about building earthquake-resistant structures that can flex when the environment changes. Tomorrow's ground systems won't be static assets. They'll be living networks, systems that can heal, reconfigure, and keep operating under pressure. This shift is being driven by forces on two fronts. Externally, the rising geopolitical tensions, the cyber escalation, and growing spectrum congestion. But internally as well, there's an expectation that networks will never go down, that uptime and SLA-backed performance are simply non-negotiable. So in the decade ahead, resilience becomes a real differentiator. Not how many antennas you have, but how fast you can recover, reallocate, and resecure your network when it matters most. So far, we've talked about where the ground segment market stands today, the rise of virtualization, software-defined networks, the economic shift towards services, and the imperative of resiliency. But if we look ahead, the next decade won't follow a straight line. The direction the market takes will depend on a few external factors, most of which we can see already forming today. So, for example, geopolitics and sovereignty are redrawing the lines of trust, who can access what and under whose rules. Technology maturity, from cloud-native architectures to digital IF, are deciding how fast virtual ground can truly scale. And capital and investor sentiment are shifting, moving the focus from heavy hardware CapEx to flexible software-driven OpEx. And finally, regulation and spectrum policy will either open the doors to a global shared GSAS ecosystem or lock networks behind national walls. So depending on how these main forces evolve, the ground segment in 2035 could look very different. Let's look at 3 plausible strategic scenarios. So the first scenario is what I'd call fortress ground. In this scenario, the response to growing geopolitical risk, cyber risk as well, and strategic competition is one of retrenchment. Governments and major operators in this scenario focus on securing, localizing, and hardening their ground infrastructure. And every nation or alliance wants assured access to its own space assets. We see duplication of gateways, regionalized cloud segments, and segregated data pipes to guarantee autonomy. So the keyword here being control. Control over where the data lands, who processes it, and who sets the rules of access. So cyber defense in this scenario becomes a defining capability, and resilience is achieved through redundancy rather than flexibility. We've seen some signs of this. The US is investing heavily in hybrid defense commercial networks under SDA and Space Force initiatives. Europe is developing I2 with requirements for European control of the full communication chain, including the ground. And even in commercial SATCOM, operators are under pressure to locate ground sites domestically or within friendly territories. So in this scenario, the market fragments along political lines. It's good for specialized, secure infrastructure providers, but less so for global interoperability or commercial scalability. But it's not all negative. Fortress ground can also accelerate investment in cyber-resilient architectures, trusted supply chains, and sovereign ground software stacks. The risk here, it's efficiency, because duplication is expensive. But the benefit is strategic independence, and for many governments, that's a price worth paying. Now we can imagine a very different path that we'll call cloud constellations, where the external driver in this scenario isn't politics, it's technology and cost pressure. In this scenario, virtualization matures, cloud providers offer near real-time digital signal processing, and antennas become simple RF endpoints, generic, software-defined, multi-mission capable. And by 2035, in this scenario, most missions operate through fully virtual ground systems orchestrated through the cloud. In this world, the ground segment is no longer a passive layer of connectivity. It's an intelligent, orchestrated network managing data flows, routing signals dynamically, and optimizing resources across constellations in near real time. The customer sees only reliability and performance. They don't care which gateway the signal passes through or where the processing happens. Economically, this scenario transforms the game. Traditional capital-heavy ground infrastructure is replaced with elastic cloud-native systems. Capacity is dynamically allocated, shared, or monetized. And operators capture value not only through bandwidth, but from data integration, analytics, and orchestration intelligence. In effect, the ground segment becomes an enabler for multi-orbit operations without the physical massive investment. We're already seeing glimpses of this reality today. Hyperscalers like AWS are demonstrating how satellites can be fully integrated into cloud-native architectures, and operators are experimenting with multi-orbit orchestration and automated scheduling, showing that the ground can be intelligent, dynamic, and service-oriented rather than fixed and passive. Of course, this scenario is not without risk. It relies on robust standards, secure interoperability, and resilient architectures. Cybersecurity, data sovereignty, and redundancy become critical when the system is highly distributed and software dependent. Yet the potential upside is enormous. By 2035, this scenario could make the ground segment invisible in operation, but indispensable in value creation. It shifts the competitive advantage to those who can control orchestration, integrate services across networks, and capture recurring value. And finally, there's the third path, market mesh. Here, the external key driver is economics and business model evolution. In this scenario, the ground segment evolves into an interconnected ecosystem rather than a collection of siloed networks. Antennas, clouds, and data platforms are no longer operated in isolation. They're part of a distributed fabric where assets are shared, scheduled, and monetized across multiple stakeholders, commercial, government, and institutional. It's the logical extension of what's already happening today. Ground segment as a service players offering on-demand antenna time, virtualization breaking the link between hardware and software, and cloud-native mission operations that make interoperability technically feasible. But in this scenario, the interoperability goes one step further. It becomes structural. Networks begin to peer with one another, much like the internet did in its early days. A commercial provider in Europe might process data for a US defense client through a local sovereign hub. A government network might lease excess capacity to an allied operator. Antenna networks could dynamically trade capacity based on orbital passes, priority levels, or latency constraints. In short, the market becomes a mesh, and data routing are optimized across multiple actors in real time. This scenario is appealing because it promises resilience, scalability, and efficiency. No single player has to build global coverage alone. Small and medium operators gain access to a wider infrastructure footprint. Governments maintain sovereignty by enforcing federation rules rather than building everything in-house, meaning that they set the rules for how networks interoperate, share capacity, and manage data, that they certify or approve trusted nodes in the federal network, and that they enforce policy and governance for data access, tasking priority, and security protocols across the federated network. But it's also a complex scenario. It requires common standards for authentication, tasking, and billing. It requires trust frameworks, political, contractual, and technical. And it requires new business models to handle shared assets and dynamic service chains. In this kind of ecosystem, success doesn't come from owning the most hardware. It comes from orchestrating value, from being the broker, the integrator, or the trusted nodes that others rely on. So the question is, will the ground segment evolve into this kind of federated market mesh, decentralized, resilient, and service-driven? Or will competitive and national interests keep networks fragmented, leaving efficiency on the table? Because if this scenario materializes, the ground segment could finally become what the space layer has long promised, a truly global, dynamic, and interconnected infrastructure layer, the foundation for everything that happens in orbit. Of course, in reality, there will likely be a patchwork of all three scenarios. Some regions will double down on sovereignty, others will virtualize aggressively, and the commercial domain will evolve towards marketplaces. What matters strategically is recognizing where your organization fits, because the next decade of the ground segment won't be defined by hardware or orbit. It will be defined by who controls the interfaces, who owns the orchestration, and who enables resilience. When we started, I spoke about invisibility, how the ground segment has always been the industry's quiet success story, the part that works flawlessly in the background, enabling everything else to shine. But as we look to the next decade, that invisibility is turning into a strategic advantage for those who can see it. Who really controls value in the space ecosystem? Who decides which networks, constellations, or services get prioritized? And who ultimately captures the revenue from the data and services flowing through space? The answer increasingly lies in the ground segment, still largely invisible, yet absolutely central. By controlling the customer interface, ground operators determine how missions are consumed, monitored, and monetized. By setting standards and enabling interoperability, they shape which networks can connect and scale. And by designing for recurring revenue through GSAS, federated networks, and service-based models, they turn infrastructure into a strategic revenue-generating asset. In other words, the ground isn't just supporting the space economy. It's defining who captures value in the next decade. From segment to fabric, from cost center to value lever, from robustness to resilience, the hidden advantage of ground is no longer hidden. It's where strategy, control, and opportunity converge. Thank you for your attention.